Jack, you have worked your whole adult life in railroading in one form or another for the real railroads and in modeling. Where did it all start?
Born and raised in a railroad family. My dad worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad before World War II. His dad worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad as a conductor, I'm told. I never met my grandfather. My dad passed away in 1947 when I was 5 years old. But he had already instilled in me going down to the railroad yards and watching the 080 switch. Was raised in Cranford, New Jersey on the Jersey Central lines. They had a commuter roundhouse there with a lot of big Wooten Firebox Pacifics and Camelbacks and stuff. And my mother was pretty adamant about she's going to break this mold. You know, you're not going to go to work for the railroad. When you get out of high school, you're going to go to college and get a good job. Well, EMD hired me right out of college in 1962, so
you took both of them and combined them. You got a good career in railroading, but still kept Mom happy.
Yeah, so yeah, she was pretty pleased with that. There was always the background of steam, because that's what I grew up with in the 40s and 50s, and the job I had was delivering new locomotives for Electromotive at the time, and there again, as luck would have it, my very first assignment was delivering GP30s to the Norfolk and Western Railroad in July 1962.
How long were you with EMD?
Almost 37 years.
So starting in the 60s, you were with EMD during their heyday, so to speak, the second generation diesels, the Dash 2s, many of which SD40-2s are still running today.
Oh yeah.
In the 21st century, because EMD got that one right.
Oh yeah, yeah. I probably learned as much about the Dash 2 series in settling details with such customers as the Southern Pacific Railroad, the Missouri Pacific Railroad, and as I gained more experience in the sales engineering department, I then became the wreck estimator and had to go out and look at wreck locomotives, and then we would give a quote what it would take to rebuild them for insurance purposes.
Where did you get involved with the 12-inch to the foot scale steam engines? When did that happen?
Well, learning what I could, watching the roundhouse activities in the early and mid-50s from my bicycle in Cranford, New Jersey, as soon as I was able to get a little bit farther away from home, was the New York and Long Branch Pennsylvania K4s down in New Jersey. And they wouldn't let me take coal. That was too dangerous for a teenager. But I learned how to clean fires, how to service the engines, how to grease them and stuff like that. And then it progressed to my assignment on the Norfolk and Western. I was moved from Roanoke, Virginia to Portsmouth, Ohio. That's where all the GP30s were being assigned to work between Williamson, Portsmouth, Portsmouth to Columbus, and Portsmouth to Cincinnati. Well, they wanted coverage on the weekends, which was fine with me because I was only about a 2-hour drive from the Buffalo Creek and Gauley Railroad in West Virginia. So I could be gone during the weekdays and go over there and get first-hand experience learning how to fire up an engine in the morning, lay fresh coal, putting the coal oil in there with waste rags and everything. They gradually taught me how to fire in the hand, the horseshoe method, and you say, well, there were only 280s, but they handled 50 to 60 empty cars upgrade 18 miles to the mine at Wyden. So I still have some back pain today from 1962 and 1963, shoveling 12, 14 tons of coal a day.
We move ahead 14 years, whatever it might be, to 1975, when the American Freedom Train idea has come to the fore. You got involved in that. How did that happen?
General Motors was the first big corporation that finally stepped up and said, okay, all you other guys, it's one of these things where, well, I'll put in $1 million if he puts in $1 million. And then he says, well, okay, I'll put in $1 million if he puts in $1 million. Nobody wanted to be first, but everybody wanted to be second, third, fourth, whatever. Well, General Motors finally said, okay, tell you what, we'll put up the first $1 million to start with the stipulation that the Freedom train had to be pulled by a steam locomotive.
So it was actually EMD that made the stipulation it had to be steam.
You know, when people hear that story, they say, well, that's just crazy. Why in the world would General Motors be concerned about what pulled the Freedom train? Well, the news media in 1975 and 1976 was no different than we are today. The first thing when the Freedom train pulled into town would say, wow, the only reason General Motors is the sponsor of this is so they can get free advertising for their locomotives. And General Motors Corporation wanted to be sure that the American Freedom train, the tour of the United States, would stand on its own merits to celebrate the bicentennial and not be clouded by whether it had a General Motors locomotive on the front. So that's the point when the Daylight was selected. It was semi-streamlined. The original Daylight colors, once the skirts were put back on, were very easy to change from the red, orange, and black to the red, white, and blue for the bicentennial, and plus it was oil-fired. So it was easily serviced, no matter where you were in the country, to take water from a fire hydrant and fill her full of 5,000 gallons of number 5 power plant oil.
Is that where your relationship with Doyle began?
That's how I started, because as soon as the American Freedom train was funded with General Motors and a couple of other 4 or 5 corporations, which slipped my mind, the word immediately came down from Detroit, okay, General Motors doesn't know anything at all about railroads, railroading, railroad motive power, whatever. But you guys in LaGrange, Illinois, you give these people whatever they want. Well, nobody at General Motors or EMD knew anything about a steam engine.
Pick me, huh?
Put me in, coach, I'm fresh. So the general service manager called me into the office at the time. I was manager of field engineering group for the service department. He says, well, you know, we finally found something you can do. Well, boss, I don't know if this, what kind of a left-handed compliment is that?
Yeah, you have to scratch your head about that one for a minute, wouldn't you?
Yeah. So, you know, have I been doing something wrong now? Well, they all got a big chuckle out of that. And Bill Becker, and I'd already knew about the Daylight. I keep up on those things. And he says, well, you know, the locomotive is finished and it's progressing to Chicago. But for security reasons, there's no place they can store it without it being stripped in any railroad yard in Chicago. So Detroit says, we're going to keep it here. So we got other people that are responsible for the power generating and air brakes and the support for the train. You are responsible for that steam engine. Deal. So it arrived at EMD in early June, I think it was. And we all met. There's the superintendent of the engineering test department and the superintendent of the locomotive manufacturing area. And McCormick and his team step off and everything. And I introduced everybody around. I'll be your liaison. And Ken Mosier, superintendent of engineering test building, says, well, you know, we're going to keep you in the engineering test building. Anything you need. Well, they'd hit a dump truck out in Utah, so they were everybody pointing at the wrinkled skirt on the one side, and they need sheet metal for that. So there was a team of people from the sheet metal shop of the engineering building, and they came out, and you know, away they go. And you know, Mosier says to McCormick, he says, well, no, what else you need? He says, well, you know, we got to do it quarterly. Ken draws a blank, and I looked at Ken and I said, well, in order to do it quarterly, he's going to have to separate the engine from the tender, hammer test the drawbars with whitewash. He's got to dead weight test all the gauges and do a boiler wash. So he's going to have access to the fire hydrant, fire hose, and a couple of steel horses with a chain fall and you know, a large forklift truck to pull the tender away. As I'm explaining all this to Ken Mosier, out of the corner of my eye, I see McCormick looking at me, you know, when he finally pokes his finger in my chest. He says, as a diesel guy, I know much about a steam engine. Long story, Mac. We'll get into that.
When did you become a regular fireman on the Daylight, and how did that lead to the work you've done with the Union Pacific steam program over the years?
A number of times, McCormick had had we come out. They were short on somebody or other and say, hey, you know, we need you for a week or 10 days. And when the tour was finally done and had to return the locomotive to the city of Portland, Oregon, in 1977, Amtrak put together that transcontinental steam excursion. So I made the whole trip from Birmingham, Alabama, where the Daylight was in winter storage after the Freedom Train engine in Miami, ended in Miami, and went all the way back to Portland, Oregon with him. And essentially every trip that the 4449 did after 1977, the grand opening of the California State Railroad Museum in 1981, all of that stuff, you know, I would go out. It was a volunteer group anymore, and sometimes the city of Portland would go through the Southern Pacific, and the president of the Southern Pacific would contact the general manager of an electromotive and say, hey, we'd like to have that guy in the service department who's got a lot of experience with this. And then I've been with the 4449 since 1976.
When did that move on to becoming a freelance guy with Union Pacific?
Sometime around the mid-1980s, we had some pretty substantial deliveries of locomotives going to the Union Pacific. And from a business standpoint with EMD, I met Steve Lee, who was road foreman of engines out in Cheyenne. And they then put him in charge of the steam program, and he had me come out once when the Challenger was still coal, and I did a student trip on that. And then he called me and said, hey, you know, we're going to convert this thing to oil because we have to go back for the 10th anniversary of the California State Railroad Museum in '91. On these long days, there's not a lot of people I can call that have experience with firing the big oil burners. Would you be willing to come out and help us? Because one of my firemen is Bob Krieger, who's a promoted engineer on the UP, and the other fireman is Lynn Nystrom, who was actually a conductor. So if you come out, that'll give us 2 engineers and 2 firemen for long days. From then on, Steve would periodically call and said, hey, we're going to do a 3 or 4 week trip, either with, at that time, 8444 or 3985. And I must admit that firing the Challenger became a real challenge, to put it bluntly. It's aside from hand firing the Southern Railway 4501, it's the most difficult locomotive I've ever had the pleasure to fire.
We've got some scenes of you firing the 3985. Let's take a look at those.
Sure.
Well, Jack, you're sitting there, you look awfully relaxed. It doesn't look like you're having too tough a time firing this thing.
Well, a lot of it depends on the terrain you're in and the engineer you're working with. And I worked a lot with Bob Krieger. When the times came where I had to fire for Steve, Steve runs slightly different. And it took me a while to develop the trick that he does. When he's ready to make a throttle adjustment, he'll put his hands up on the throttle and wait 10, 15 seconds. Well, if you have good wide periphery vision, as you're watching out the head, you're paying attention to track signals, stuff like that, when you see his hands go up, now it's time to look over and see what he's going to do. Is he going to reduce the throttle or increase the throttle? And that shows you what you need to do with the firing valve. If I didn't catch Steve reducing the throttle by a quarter, all of a sudden there's black whipped cream coming out the stack, and I look over and he's got this possum grin on his face going, ha ha, you weren't paying attention. So, you know, practice makes perfect, and firing for Krieger, he'd always tell you, if I was paying attention to something else, he'd make a sound over there, he'd holler, okay, yep, he's going to do something. And when they go all the way down to a drift, then I knew, you know, get the blower on because he's going to stop for something. So I get pretty relaxed because, especially if there's visitors in the cab, I try to be paying attention to what's ahead of you on the railroad and not be sitting there looking at the steam gauge all the time, not paying attention to what's going on. And as I got more and more experience with the Challenger, and of course the 844 is like laying off. That's the easiest thing in the world to fire. There's nothing that the engineer can do to you on the 844 to run you out of steam. If I have to, I can force the blower big time with those great big twin exhaust stacks and keep up if I have to, but that was a rare.
I had an opportunity to talk with Doyle a couple of months ago relating to the 765's tour this summer with NS. And he made the comment that you had worked with him for 30 some odd years and were probably the best fireman that he had ever worked with on the Daylight. And he also said it's largely because you guys had worked together so much that you knew how to work together. It really is a team effort, running and firing a steam engine, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, especially an oil burner. A coal burner, people want to know the differences. Well, a coal burner, you have this massive heat sink of coal. It reacts very slowly to changes that the engineer makes in either throttle or cutoff. Where an oil burner, you don't have a fire. You've got a flame, an enormous flame, granted, but the slightest change that the engineer makes as you're accelerating, as he hooks it up, and the back pressure drops, the draft drops, so that changes the air into the firebox from the vacuum in the smoke box. So you have to make an adjustment on your firing valve, otherwise it's either making too much smoke or all of a sudden the stack goes clear, and then you're like, wait a minute, what's going on here? Because then you'll be losing steam because you're keeping up with the water going in that the engineer's taking out. So it's the slightest adjustment that the engineer makes in a big locomotive like 4449, 844, or the Challenger's even harder. And that's the reason that McCormick had developed this, the Daylight's got an air horn valve. So you'll see on videos, you'll hear this sound when somebody's had a microphone in the cab, like Mobile Fidelity, late Brad Miller, you hear this. That gets your attention to look over to see what he's doing with the throttle. You say, well, why is that big a deal? Well, going back to the Freedom Train, you got to remember that this was such a huge event that we had crowds of people in the cab of the 4449. And I can remember firing on a number of times, especially at night because the train always moved at night, where we had 10, 12 people in the cab of the Daylight. You couldn't see the engineer. You couldn't see what Doyle was doing over there.
Oh, my.
So he would tap, tap on the air horn valve, and you could look over and look up at the upper quadrant of the throttle and see which way it was going.
See which way it moved.
And then you knew what to do. And if it's nighttime, it's hard to see the stack. So we all just developed into that habit. Doyle says it also provides some semblance of professionalism for the railroad management people that may be riding the cab, that, these guys don't ever say much, but, they all seem to know what each other's doing.
Always in sync.
Right. So that's why that developed, and I've always prided myself to try to maintain a safe level of water in the glass, regardless of the terrain, as close to 300 pounds on the boiler as I can, the boiler pressure, and still keep a clear stack as I can, which tends to aggravate the photographers.